cool. Do you mind if I record you for my vidcast, data stream? My data stream, it goes out to everyone in the system. It goes into space.
Sure.
Could I interview you for my spacecast? Goes into space. You mind if I interview you for my video spacecast?
Okay.
You can talk!
Greetings, everybody. Greetings to the one episode show. This is the Chillax Podcast. It's the best podcast. It's gonna have only one episode to it, so you don't have to tune in anytime later. This is the one time that you have to give me your attention, so I expect that you give it to me fully. Anyway, this is about to be a podcast about the fantastic new show on Netflix called The Midnight Gospel. It's an interesting show because it is actually the first podcast adaptation into something else. Like we talk about the adaptations in the sense of we take one format and we transfer it into another. In the vein of books and comics and stuff like that, it's usually talking about films and shows where we talk a written media and transform it into a visual medium. Here we take an auditorial medium and transform it into a visual medium as well, although the main focus on this one is still going to be the audio. So what actually happened was that a man named Duncan Trussell had a podcast called the Duncan Trussell Family Hour, in which he would invite a lot of guests from all facets of life and talk to them about topics like meditation, drugs, psychedelia, like spiritual stuff. Anything comes, anything goes. They talk about death, they talk about the loss of a loved one, and usually it's in a very comedic sense. Like it's very obvious that both participants are having a lot of fun talking about these topics. Gotta take a sip of my glorious beer. Anyway, the podcasts themselves are like an hour 30 minutes long, each of them, but the adaptation is supposed to be like, it's a show, so it's 20 minutes long. So the format itself is that you take one podcast conversation, one interviewee, and you cut down the show to only its most essential parts, and then you put it into an animated series in which each episode follows what's supposed to be the representation of Duncan, the host of the podcast, in the form of a character called Clancy, which hosts what is called a spacecast, as in a podcast in space. It's a very clever word choice from the creators. And so each episode he goes on to a new journey from his what is called a simulation farmer machine, in which the machine itself can transform Clancy, the character, to a new universe, a new dimension, basically, in which everyone has different rules and conditions. What's bringing them all together is that each one of those universes, when Clancy visits them, is experiencing some kind of apocalypse, like a zombie apocalypse, a flood. One has like a medieval demons roaming the place. It's very imaginative in a sense. And so the show basically came about because Pendleton, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, the creator of Adventure Time, has actually watched the podcast that Duncan has made. He actually thought of the idea of adapting the podcast into animation, and obviously Duncan, being the fun-loving guy that he is, really was onto the idea. And it took a couple of years getting it done, but eventually it did, and now it's in the form of the Midnight Gospel, which is, in my opinion, a journey in and of itself. Talking about journeys, but being a journey by itself. It's very nice. Anyway, the show was received very well in general, but what I've noticed browsing IMDb user reviews and Metacritic scores is that there's a big gap in understanding in the show. It's like, it's a coin flip. Either you really, really love it, you understand the concept, you don't mind that it's basically a podcast in the form of a show, you get in the moment, you understand the conversation, And maybe you don't really like agree with everything, but you understand that it's not a show about agreeing with what the characters or the interviews are really talking about. It's basically taking in their perspective of life and integrating it into yours. And the animation is like another way that you can perceive the show, the animation being present. Oh god, editing this is gonna be it's gonna be troublesome. I'm talking all over the place. I don't know how to do this this shit. Never done a podcast before. It's so hard to keep on topic. Like I have a talking points list, but never mind. When I've seen the trailer for this show, I've seen it actually after I've watched the whole show. It's really a shame how our format of trailers in this day and age, the 1.5 minutes format, just can't really bring what this show is about to life. From viewing the trailer, it doesn't actually give you much of the segments from the podcast. It doesn't seem like what it would actually be to watch it, which is, in terms of the experience, it's watching two characters, animated avatars, go through an apocalyptic world with a weird adventure happening while they're actually just having a normal, chill conversation with one another about important life moments. Yeah, it's a shame. The trailer actually leads the viewer to believe that this is gonna be like another Rick and Morty type show with intense violence and profanities that are the main focus. Like, it can't really transfer how it would be to view it. It actually uses the violence and profanity to attract a specific adult audience who would generally be more open-minded to other topics. Like when you view violence as just another facet of life, and you don't mind seeing it on TV, it doesn't give you like a gut reaction, you are probably someone who's more open philosophically as well. And I feel like that's what the show is doing. It's trying to attract you with the violence and profanity, but makes you stay for the kindness and community and like the philosophical value of each discussion that is being presented within the chats. It was actually released on April 20, the official Stoner Day, in which everybody gathers around, smokes a lot of pot, and watches like shows like this. And it's also Duncan Trussell's birthday, which actually connects with the last episode of the show, which actually talks about birth, rebirth, and death. In general, the show is more attuned to the stoner mind because of how smoothly it goes between topic and topic, and how it expects you to gather it all in without questioning like too much. Like, the suspension of disbelief is very specific in the show. It's very important. It's important to be in a mindset that is acclaimed to new ideas and doesn't reject them outright, to gain like the feeling of the waviness that the show produces. Oh my god, this beer shit. I'm gonna get so blown out by the end of this. Cheers. You don't know this, but I'm also listening to like new jobbers in the background. Lo-fi, hip-hop, shit like that. Just to keep my mental state in any way like on track to something. Because honestly, this is kind of killing me. I should really be attuned to the show more, be more like wavy. Anyway, the topic of this video is like, this is actually the first full podcast adaptation, which is interesting because it's not something you would expect to see at all. But actually, when I thought about it, it turns out I've actually seen podcast adaptations before. There was a trend that is probably still ongoing, but it's very specific to it's community specific, which is that amateur animators would take segments of podcasts they liked, like the co-optional podcast, the roundtable podcast usually pertaining to gaming, which had some memorable moments to them, and would animate the moments in like a 3 to 5 minute segments, which was actually pretty successful. And basically what they did in that format is you have the avatars usually dressed in costumes and something like that to give it a bit more, to give each one more character than their real life counterpart, and they would talk about the subjects. It will be lip synced, but it will also like take it a step further and actually present what they're talking about in real time. Like, I've seen one with Jim Sterling and the co-optional podcast where they talk about him being poor and dirty and eating like an onion and cheese sandwich, and then you can actually see the grossness of the onion and cheese and him being in his underwear in a dark apartment. It gives the podcast, as opposed to being audio only or seeing the faces, it gives it personality on the next level. It's makes it more of an experience as opposed to something you do in the background. Like usually today podcasters are presented with either only sound or like a static image presenting maybe the interviewee for the episode. It could also be like unrelated background footage, like video games or shows if that's being talked about and they can get over the shitty copyright system. It's also, like in the case of Joe Rogan, it's a live action recording in a studio, or maybe if it's a sports podcast, it can be like in the arena, if it's football or basketball or whatever. That's usually how podcasts are presented. This is actually an anomaly in terms of podcast presentation, obviously, mostly because it just takes a lot more effort, but it gives it a very special vibe. There's nothing really like it in that sense. So in terms of plot and presentation of the thing, the actual story of Clancy, which is a representation of Duncan, as I said, is set in a universe called Chromatic Ribbon, where he moves through apocalypse to apocalypse, meets with different avatars that represent the interviewee for that episode, and then they talk for the course of the whole episode, while an animated adventure goes in the background of what the talk really is. The story has 3 lines to it, like the 2 episodic ones and 1 other overarching. The episodic ones are the ones like the interview itself, the segments from the podcast, what's being talked about and whatever. The other episodic one are the ones that happen in the background, like in one episode there's a zombie apocalypse and Clancy has to survive with the president. In another one, Clancy joins a female warrior trying to save and avenge the death of her boyfriend from like a maniac or something like that. That's what's happening in the background. And the overarching one is about like how the machine that Clancy uses is malfunctioning and becoming weirder and weirder, and how planets are destructing at a faster rate. Usually these lines don't really interact with one another, like the conversation is happening and the adventure is happening. They happen at the same time, but they don't affect one another. There are only brief moments in which like a voice line would be attuned to, like if they're underwater, then the voice would be more muffled, or they would react to an explosion on screen, but those are very rare, and usually the conversation and the adventure are interchangeable. They're like not affecting on one another too much. That results in actually having the animated segment of the adventure being not bound by anything, as opposed to other shows which usually have a plot and like a theme or style that they need to follow. This one is an expression of complete freedom, since it isn't relying on anything. They can do whatever they want. They can change the style, they can make it black and white. They can create creatures that are out of this world, they can create whatever they want. It's anything that comes to mind of the animator. The format allows for complete creativity. The definition of psychedelia, which isn't bound by any rules. You can do anything. It's actually magnificent to watch. Just the animation. What I found most interesting about the show, and is the topic of what I'll actually want to talk about in this video, in this podcast, it's a podcast, it's better than a video, is the chemistry between the audio and the visuals, how they shift and turn, and how they affect one another. Because what this show is actually doing, it's a collaboration of a visual master, Pendleton Ward, Pendleton Ward, the animator for Adventure Time, and an audio master like Trussell, which is a comedian. He uses his voice in very specific ways. Why did I do that? In very specific ways. The thing is that on the surface there is not much connecting the audio and the visuals of each episode. But if there was no connection at all, we would have been baffled at what we were seeing and wouldn't have tried to make the connection, like symbolically, to what is being presented visually. The connection with the voice lines and the visuals. Instead, through assigning the interviewer and the interviewee with avatars who are lip-syncing to the sound and also react sometimes to what's happening in the background, our imagination can form the connections and try to make sense of the whole thing on its own, which creates a very subjective but also beautiful watching experience. On the subject of how the show makes us remember what is being talked about, because generally in a podcast it's difficult. It's more difficult to remember a podcast which is audio only. So what this show does the best in terms of its adaptation from a podcast into a show is making us remember specific bits by making the brain form neural connections with scenarios and imagery through the animation. Remembering a specific bit on the visual sense, like the zombie apocalypse in my case, reminds me of meditation and drugs, and that reminds me the segment in which one of the characters, the president says that drugs are not bad in any sense, it's how we use them. So we don't need to be overly negative or overly positive about them, just understand that they are there. That neural connection that just happened is only because of the visual imagery of the zombie apocalypse. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. Remembering just words is difficult. Our brain is better at remembering visuals, and it also is very good when it remembers something to move on to the next thing, like form connections between memories, which is what this show does very well. You can remember a phone call just by going to the place where it happened for you. On the opposite end, it's also the reason why saying specific words, like racial slurs or bigoted terms, would trigger someone who has had an experience in which these words are used against them. It triggers back the memory and makes you really become the past self which has experienced that moment, which is, it's terrible. Don't use shitty words. It's not that bad. Unless you know nobody's gonna get hurt or triggered by them when you use them. That's whatever. Well, that's off topic. In the case of memory, each episode gives both Clancy and the interviewee different avatars. Like Clancy changes his character every time he enters a new simulation, and he meets with characters who don't necessarily align with reality or physics. Like there's one character who's basically a robot body with a fish tank on its head, and the fish is the character. That's a lot more memorable than real human beings, which has less variables to their structure and visual appearance. Another thing that helps is the variation of the worlds and characters that Clancy visited. It helps separate each episode from one another visually, which allows us to remember the conversation separately and also better. Our brain really likes partitions in terms of beginnings, middles, and ends, and can store that information better. By presenting two different storylines at the same time, the show faces a challenge of making the animation and voice not disrupt each other. It could be a very difficult task to follow both of them at the same time, which is honestly a bit difficult, but maybe that's a reason to watch the show twice, who knows? Researching for this podcast thing, I've checked some science relating to music videos and how accompanying visuals increase or decrease the song's appeal to the listeners. It has been found out that having visuals help prevent the wear-out of repeated viewing for a song, which in the terms of this show and the podcast would mean that when listening to a 1.5 hour podcast show, you are probably more likely to leave at some point than you are watching a 20-minute segmented podcast show with accompanying visuals that help keep your focus straight. In an experiment where static images and videos were presented with music, the presence of visuals has changed how the music was perceived. With visuals, the melodies were perceived to be faster, louder, active, and more rhythmic than the ones without them, which is something that watching the show can demonstrate, because these conversations that are happening on screen are very much dynamic. They don't feel like normal conversations. They feel like actual people are making these conversations while under moments of intense change as they move through the adventure. The visuals actually make the conversation seem more action-based, and that's nice. Our brain senses and processes things multisensorily or multimodally. It means that stimulating one aspect of our senses, like hearing for example, can cause the brain to produce feedback on another sense, like the vision, and vice versa. And in terms of how good our brain at for processing images and sound, our brain is very much the parts in the brain that processes visuals are much bigger than the ones that processes sound. Our brain remembers visuals more concretely, and so by remembering the visuals we can transfer that into the remembering of the topic that was being talked about while those visuals were being presented, again with forming neural connections. Never done something like this before. new experience. Anyway, just listening to podcasts without doing anything is kind of boring. You're just using one sense. However, if you wash the dishes, you clean the room, you do sports, play a game in the meantime, the podcast itself becomes much more interesting and engaging. It's doing the activity, it focuses your mind in a way. Watching the show is similar in that it lets us be more invested in the podcast while having our eyes and brains be more active, moving across the psychedelic visuals and tale being presented. Like it gives our brain that little bit that needs to be more engaged in order to make the experience whole. While conversations themselves don't have a lot of actions, as a result, and they can become quite boring to listen to, if there is a connection between the action on screen that is gained from the animation, the conversation itself gains a rhythm and pacing. They build off of one another and balance themselves out, and the brain loves that shit. It also loves synchronicity, the concept of having sound and visuals align with one another. Like, there's a big theory how like Pink Floyd and The Wizard of Oz are completely synchronized, which is insane considering it's an album and a movie. It's a 1.5, and it's a segment of like an hour that is completely synchronized to people. That's how the brain works. It forms those connections beautifully, even if they're not there. Like you can find those videos on YouTube, like on theme You Say Run goes with anything, Attack on Titan's opening goes with anything. Those are everywhere because our brain is great, and that's why editing is such a powerful tool, because you just put a visual segment and an audio on the same line and the brain does all the work. You don't really need them to fit that much because the brain likes them to fit and it will work towards that. In general, we expect a certain kind of stimulation from our media, like some auditorial and some visual. In movies, we usually expect more visual stimulation than we do audio, but the audio stimulation is still there. It's usually more in the background, like the action shown visually is what's more important. Even when characters are talking, it's usually how it's presented than what is said that is more important to us as human beings. As account of what I said earlier, with being more attuned to visual stimulation. With music, it's obviously almost only audio. Podcasts, usually only audio. YouTube videos are an interesting form because they obviously have very much variation in them. But let's take the classic commentary video, for example. The audio is the king of the video. That's the boss that's guiding the editing in the background, which is usually just there to help form the point that is being said auditorially better. But the audio is what dictate the editing. On another sense, we have like YouTube skits like Smosh or Caleb City, which have the visuals dictate the audio in a way. It's all about where is the anchor and who's playing around it. Music videos are an example of how the music dictates the visuals, but they're actually more akin to what this show is about, the Midnight Gospel, because the music and the visuals are not intrinsically connected. They're usually connected in the sense of lip syncing, but the actual clips are not necessarily going to align with the words being said in the song. Anyway, I love audio and I love visuals, and when they fit, that's very nice. Let's move on to the next segment. What is the message of the show? What's the point of it all? And the point gathers around with the integration of sound and audio and human beings. The message of the show, the ultimate message of the shows, from what I can gather, is that no matter the mess you and the world are in, one can always find peace in community and the act of listening to another entity, which is both what Clancy does by listening to the interviewees and what you are doing by listening to the conversations. If you do it correctly, you take some of it out. You trade parts in a way, just like Clancy does. In each of his conversation, he takes something from the other person and gives something back, and they both become a different person afterwards. The show actually has an autobiographical aspect to it, because as Trussell has been told through interviews, the moments that have been chosen for each episode's interview are presenting moments that have changed his understanding of life drastically, that in his terms have made him a different person afterwards. Someone who would perceive and gain information differently from how he was before. And it is structured in a way that it shows some kind of journey that Clancy or Trussell is going through by understanding and coming to terms with reality, with accepting the situation, with mindfulness practices, using Eastern philosophy, until the last episode where he needs to come to terms with the death of a loved one. Like, that's the ultimate challenge of life, in a way. It's losing someone that you love. And all of the conversations are like preparation for that moment for him, it's actually really sad. Each episode ends with Clancy leaving the simulation barely as it's about to end, like as the avatars of the interview are about to die. He leaves the situation, and usually he gains some objects from it, but unlike other simulation farmers in this universe, he doesn't sell it, he doesn't gain any money from it. It's just a memento from his journey. And most importantly, from each episode, from each universe, he takes shoes, like different shoes that comes with him that he places on a shelf, which are a representative of him having walked a mile in another person's shoes, learning and understanding how they perceive the world, and becoming better as a result. Anyway, the ultimate goal of this show is integration and inspiring openness, and not necessarily to agree with what's being said, but to listen. It's about listening to others, giving them space in your own mind, and not rejecting it. By doing that, we can hopefully accept that everything ends, and that we can live in the present, crying when we feel like it, and letting go, eventually, of whatever. Just like I'm about to let go of this wonderful podcast that I'll have big trouble editing, but I'll have to remember that for now, that is in the future. In the present, I am drunk and actually kinda happy. I don't know how this went, I don't know what's the reception gonna be, but I've given you my voice, and I hope that you'll listen to it, with the accompanying visuals of this fantastic show. Goodbye, everybody! Woo!